Hi, everybody. We're going to get started. Thanks a lot of you came to see Andrew Schiff's brother today, and we haven't. Actually, I'm Andrew Schiff. I'm Peter's brother. I run the marketing communications for Europe Pacific Capital down in New York City. A lot of you may have a copy of How an Economy Grows and Why It Crashes, which is something that I had a little to do with, or a lot to do with, depending on who we're talking to. But it's a great book. I had a great time working on it with Peter. Actually, I came back from Germany about 3 or 4 months ago. The book was translated into German, and it was called, I should know this. Wie eine Volkswirtschaft wächst und warum sie abstürzt. Any German speakers here? That actually means how an economy grows and why it crashes. And it won a pretty big award out in Germany. And when I was out there, I spoke to a lot of reporters, and it landed with a little bit more of a thud there than it did here. And now when you see the news, I mean, it makes sense that it would be more accepted in Germany, because the Germans at this point in time in history have a little more receptive to the idea of savings and production and to not inflate your way out of difficulty. So it was very interesting for me to be out there. Anyway, so I'm here to introduce Peter Schiff. I'm sure you know of Peter, otherwise you wouldn't be here. President, CEO of Europe Pacific Capital. Fairly well-known talking head on television, economist. He's been out there probably on TV, I'd say 1,000 times since 2005 when he first hit the airwaves. And I've been working with Peter on the media side for a long, long time, and I'll tell you that it's a lot more difficult right now to get the media to stand up and take notice of what he's having to say than it was a couple of years ago. Back in 2008, 2009, it was a good time for us media-wise and public opinion-wise. Our ideas were getting out there, probably because in 2008 and 2009 there were very few people before that who were actually saying, there's a problem with the economy. Things might run off the rails. So when it actually did happen, the way that Peter predicted it, it was pretty much inevitable that he'd get a lot of attention. So we did get a lot of attention, and people kind of stood up and took notice, and they raised a couple of eyebrows. But starting around 2010 or late 2009, when the things started, the economy seemed to turn around because the unprecedented stimulus that was being pumped out of the system. The numbers started looking a little better, and then the optimism kind of took over. And since 2010 or so, I definitely get the perception that we've been kind of pushed out to the sidelines again. Although it's not the same as it was before, because a lot more people now are understanding that something is wrong, and that there's something happening here, but what it is isn't exactly clear. So there's certainly a much greater support out there than there was before, but still the mainstream is not looking in our direction. They're thinking everything's great, and they're thinking that we've turned the corner. So it's tough to say, we haven't, because you don't want to spoil the party, but that's where we're at. Anyway, so a couple of announcements here. We're going to go for about an hour and 15 minutes with Peter speaking. At the end of that, we're building in about 45 minutes worth of Q&A. We've got a microphone over there and a microphone over there. So if you want to ask a question, I will tell you that Peter's answers tend to be long. So even with 45 minutes worth of Q&A time, I doubt we'll get to more than like 8 or 9 questions. So if you really got a burning question, my advice would be get there early and kind of keep your eye on the watch. And I'll think about an hour 15 after he starts talking. Another thing I want to mention is that if you're very interested in investing in global in foreign investing, which is what we specialize in Europe Pacific Capital. First of all, there are a number of Europe Pacific representatives here. Many of you already have probably relationships with some of our brokers. We have brokers up here from our Connecticut office, which is in Westport, and from our Manhattan office, which is where I work. So there's about 7 or 8 brokers here. If you want to just talk and just chew the fat and see what we're doing and just talk about the investment landscape, they'll be happy to talk with you. There's a little area over by the drinks, the beverage area, which you can use as like just a little chat session. Be happy to do that. Come up, look for me, come talk to me, that'd be fine. But I want to mention that at the end of next month, May 31st, if you know anybody, you might want to mention this to them, in New York at the Sofitel Hotel, we're doing our 2nd annual Europe Pacific Global Investment Conference. We've got about 52 companies from around the world coming in to present, talk about themselves and their businesses. They're presenting primarily to institutional investors. These are people from big companies who invest for a living, but it is a conference that's open to the public, the retail investing public. If you want to come down, it's a fascinating day. A lot of information. We give you breakfast, lunch, and dinner at the Sofitel. Then we have a cocktail party afterwards with a live band. It's a lot of fun. The tickets are $295 for the whole day. We're also, if you want to spend the night in the city, we're getting a good block rate at the Sofitel on 46th Street. Great hotel. We got rooms for $300 there. So if you want information about that, or if you know anyone in the area that you might want to attend, tell them about it. Information is on our website, europac.net. www.europac.net. That being said, let me bring out, with no further ado, former Senate candidate from Connecticut, author of, his new book. We tried to get that for this seminar, the new book, The Real Crash, America's Coming Bankruptcy. It's coming out in like 3 weeks. We tried to get it for this conference, but it just didn't work out. But it's coming off the presses in about 3 weeks. So that's coming out. You can pre-order it right now on Amazon. You get it's like $14. It's a hardcover book. So I recommend that you do that. And if you come to our conference at the end of this next month in New York, we'll have the books there, and that comes with your price of admission. So anyway, here's Peter Schiff.
I would have thought we would have been able to fill this room up. This is, New York. We've got a lot of clients in this area. We actually had one of these seminars in Phoenix. We had like 700 people in Phoenix. But anyway, thanks to my brother for introducing me. Some of you might have known about my brother from, there was a recent article about chronologizing his troubles living in Brooklyn. And for those of you who were concerned about my brother's position, you'll be happy to know that he did buy that condo and he will be having a dishwasher. So he's not going to be washing his dishes by hand much longer. Actually, I was speaking at an event in the city, and someone came up to me and thought that I was my brother, because they said, I read about your predicament there. And I said, no, you're talking about my brother. But anyway, so I want to talk a little bit about where we are in the economy, and more important, what's going to happen in the years ahead. Because as my brother alluded to when he spoke, the conventional wisdom is that we dodged a bullet, boy. We could have had a real collapse. It might have been another depression, but we had Ben Bernanke on the job, and the Fed came in. In fact, there was one magazine that had a picture of Ben Bernanke on the cover as the hero. He saved us. Of course, we had stimulus under both Bush and Obama, and that this wise monetary fiscal stewardship of the economy resulted in us narrowly missing what could have been this huge collapse. Fortunately, we missed it. The worst is behind us. The economy is now growing once again, maybe not as rapidly as we would like, but that's because of the severity of the problems. But, we're going to see this recovery. It's the equivalent of happy days are here again, just not quite as happy as we'd like. But don't worry, if we keep on this course, things will get much better. That is the view. That is the conventional view that is out there, and it's completely wrong. And it's the same view, or the same people that hold that view are the same people that thought everything was great right up until the point that the economy went off the edge of a cliff. And I think the reason that the establishment, whether it's the establishment on Wall Street, in academia, in Washington, the reason that they don't understand the severity of the problems now is because they didn't understand the problem back then. And since they didn't understand the actual nature of the problem, they're under the false impression that the cures worked. What they don't understand is that the cure has merely exacerbated the very problems that caused the collapse in the first place. The problems that they don't understand. See, if you look at the conventional wisdom, even Ben Bernanke's, one of his lectures that he gave over at George Washington University, if you want to see my response to it, I went down to Washington and I gave a lecture there at the Reason Foundation headquarters, and it's on the internet, so you can see my attempt to set the record straight. But one of the things that Ben Bernanke said, the problem is today is that people are just not borrowing and spending as much as they were before the crisis. So he thinks the solution is just to get people to borrow and spend like they did before. But that was the problem. The problem was people were borrowing and spending too much. We had a debt crisis. So the fact that people are spending and borrowing less, that's a good thing. We don't want to go back to the reckless borrowing and spending that we had just before the financial crisis. Yet that seems to be the policy goal of the Federal Reserve, to recreate the very conditions that led to the crisis in the first place. And of course, a lot of economists will look at reasons why Americans aren't spending. And there are the reasons why they're not spending are pretty clear, even to Keynesians. They'll say, well, Americans don't have all the home equity they used to have. They no longer have the jobs they used to have. We have a lot more Americans who are unemployed. They're spending more money for gas. They're spending more money for food. So they don't have the extra money to go out and buy stuff. They're broke. And that's all true. But the government solution, the Keynesian solution is, well, if the people are too broke to spend, and the economy, as we all know, is based on spending, if the people can't spend, well, the government has to spend for them. The government needs to replace the demand that has been lost in the private sector, and so by government spending, that's going to create all this demand, and that is what is going to grow this economy. And so that is the current policy. But wait a minute. Nobody stops to think, if the people are not spending because they're broke, how can the government spend? Because the government has no money. All the government can do is take money from the people. Well, how do you take money from people who are already broke? Now, I guess the government can go out and borrow money and spend it, but borrow from whom, and who stands behind those loans? Because after all, the government's ability to repay its loans rests on its ability to tax the very people who are too broke to spend right now. See, the fact of the matter is Americans are broke, and the solution is not for the government to drag them deeper into debt so that they're even more broke. The solution is that Americans have to stop spending. And they have to stop consuming, they have to start saving, they have to underconsume, they have to invest so we can produce more. And the government, by running these huge deficits, gets in the way of that process. The government is preventing the economy from healing. See, the underlying problems in the U.S. economy that were at the heart of the housing bubble and the financial crisis and all the troubles that we have is that we spend too much. We consume too much, which means we don't produce enough, we don't save enough. And what is the source of these macro imbalances? The source is the Federal Reserve. It is interest rates that are the problem. The problem is interest rates are too low. They've been too low for years. And what does that do? What is the effect of interest rates being too low? Well, it's obvious what the effect is. We can observe the effect all around us. If interest rates are too low, people aren't going to want to save. Why should I save when I hardly get paid to save? Why should I save money when the real inflation rate is higher than the interest? So if I save money, by the time I go to spend it, it's worth less than when I saved it. So if interest rates are very low, it sends a signal to savers, don't save. On the other side, if interest rates are really low, people want to borrow. Hey, it's cheap, why not borrow? Because I can pay it back in depreciated currency. The lower the interest rates, the cheaper it is to borrow. The more people want to borrow. The more the government borrows. I mean, why is it that we have these enormous budget deficits? How is it that the government can spend $1.40 for every dollar it collects in taxes? Because the interest rates are so low. How can the government finance a $14, $15 trillion national debt? Because the interest rates are so low. Could the government operate with all this debt if interest rates were higher? Not a chance. Now the federal government, the Federal Reserve, is trying to perpetuate this phony economy through artificially low interest rates. And the result is that our economy is all messed up. All the resources, land, labor, capital, they're all misallocated. They're where they would not be if we had a market rate of interest. See, in a market economy, which is the type of economy we're supposed to have, Prices are set in the market. The government doesn't just fix the price by executive decree. The market sets a price, and that's a function of supply and demand, and that gives you a real market clearing price. Well, we don't have that with interest rates. We determine interest rates in America, you know, the way the old Soviet Union used to determine the price of bread. We just make it up. And of course, when you just set an interest rate, you create problems. And the government is constantly picking a rate that's too low, the Federal Reserve is, because they're trying to artificially stimulate an economy. If you have an economy that's based on spending borrowed money, you have to keep the cost of borrowing artificially low, otherwise the whole thing falls apart. And to me, I think that the Federal Reserve's mission seems to be just to re-elect every incumbent administration. No matter whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, their job is to get them re-elected. And the way politicians get re-elected is if the voters think things are good. And so you never want to tell them any bad news. You never want to tell them that the economy is sick, and this is the bitter-tasting medicine that you have to swallow to get better. No politician wants to have to run on that platform. They want to say everything is great. They want to continue this high feeling, even if it's not warranted. So they want to pass out, you know, the goodies. They want to pass out drugs so that no one has to come off the stimulus high. So if you look back at the situation as it exists now, and think, well, you know, how did we get here? The financial crisis that resulted from the bursting of the housing bubble was purely the consequence of government stimulus. The idea that we need to stimulate our way out of this crisis is backwards. We stimulated our way into the crisis. The stimulus is the source of our problems. You see, when George Bush was elected president in 2000, W. Bush, he inherited a situation similar, but of a lesser magnitude than the one that Obama inherited from him. See, he walked into a situation where a phony economic boom centered around the stock market, and in particular the technology market and internet, had created a false prosperity during the Clinton years, particularly the second term of Clinton. And when the cheap money high wore off, early in Bush's first term, we entered a recession. Now that should have been a much more severe recession than it was. And why did we need a severe recession in Bush's first term? Well, because we had a lot of problems that needed to be solved. See, the problems come in the boom. So during the boom, because the Fed had interest rates too low in the 1990s, and they weren't as low as they are now, but they were too low. And the result was a lot of money went into the stock market that shouldn't have, and particularly these dot-coms. And so a lot of businesses were created that never should have been created. All kinds of crazy companies were going public with sky-high valuations, and they didn't make any money. They had no real prospects to make money. But they were sporting billion-dollar market caps. They rented office space. They hired people. They did all kinds of things. And when the bubble burst, that exposed the mistakes that were made, all these bad decisions. People were hired. Now they needed to be fired. Office space now was going to be subleased. I mean, investors lost money. And we were going to go through a recession as we rearranged everything to get it right. You see, the politicians, they love the boom, because that's when everybody feels great, even though that's when you're doing all the stupid things. They don't like the bust, but the bust is the good part. The bust is where you correct the problems. It's like if you go out and you get drunk, maybe you do some stupid things while you're drunk. You don't even realize how stupid they are until the following morning. And then the alcohol wears off, and you think, gee, how could I have done that? How could I have been so stupid? Yeah, people think, how could I have bought that internet stock? What was I thinking? Or how could I have bought that condo? Well, you're drunk. You're drunk on cheap money. You do stupid things. We right the situation. We correct the mistakes during the bust. Politicians don't like it. I mean, it's not popular to have a bust and to have to lose money and to have to admit that you made some bad decisions. People lose jobs. I mean, eventually they'll get different jobs that are more viable to the economy, but it doesn't feel good to the person losing that job. He's not likely to re-elect or vote for the incumbent who he might blame for his bad circumstances. So what did George Bush do? Did George Bush basically level with the American public and say, look, we made a lot of mistakes under my predecessor, we're just going to have to deal with it? No, he said, we're going to stimulate, we're going to fight this recession with everything we got. And so we had some budget deficits, and the Fed lowered interest rates down to 1%. And the result was we didn't have the deep recession that we would have had the government stayed out of the way. Now, is the economy better off because we fought off that recession with stimulus? Not a chance. It's much worse off. Now, maybe in the short run, maybe it helped get George Bush a second term. That was worth all the cost just to have him in office another 4 years. But what was the consequence? What did we buy for this? Maybe we bought ourselves, 5-6 years of phony prosperity? What was the consequence? The consequence was the housing bubble. That's what we got. That's what we got from 1% interest rates. Ben Bernanke claims that the cheap money that was coming from the Fed had nothing to do with the housing bubble. He says it was pure random coincidence that we had this record low interest rates and people decided to borrow all that money and use it to buy houses. Doesn't he realize that the whole subprime market was built on teaser rates? And that was all a gift from the Fed? That the whole idea about an adjustable rate mortgage meant that you got low rates initially? Where did those low rates come from? They didn't come from the market, they came from the Federal Reserve. Without the Fed, there's no housing bubble, pure and simple. And without Fannie and Freddie, you needed Fannie and Freddie to guarantee these mortgages. After all, people aren't going to loan money to people who can't pay them back until the government guarantees the loan. So it was all the government, the moral hazard created by government, that created this housing bubble. Once it got going, towards the very end, Wall Street collateralized some of the stuff that even the government wouldn't guarantee. But by then, people were so intoxicated by cheap money, nobody can think straight on Wall Street or on Main Street. And in fact, to keep it going, Fannie and Freddie became the biggest buyers of subprime mortgages. Even though they couldn't originate them, they were buying them all up like they were going out of style. They were keeping the party going. That was the job. In fact, if you look at the Federal Reserve, people started to point out the housing bubble. I wasn't the only one. I was there. I was writing articles about it, urging the Fed to raise interest rates. The Fed didn't want to raise interest rates. I think they knew there was a housing bubble, but they also knew that the entire phony recovery depended on that housing bubble. So the Fed wanted to protect it. The Fed wanted to defuse the fears that were building that there was a housing bubble. So in 2004, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, headed by Timothy Geithner, came out with a comprehensive study in which the Federal Reserve conclusively proved that there was no housing bubble, and that all the concerns about a housing bubble were misplaced because the Fed had a study to say that there was no housing bubble. Now, when that study first came out, I wrote an article and I said, what are they, blind? Or then I came to the conclusion that it's pure propaganda. I said the Fed must be so afraid of this housing bubble that they wrote this article to say that it wasn't there. Because what would the Fed had to have done in 2004 if they acknowledged the existence of a housing bubble? They would have had a cricket, which meant they would have had to raise interest rates much higher than they were. Fannie and Freddie would have had to tighten up on their lending standards, and that would have brought on the financial crisis or the collapse. It would have happened sooner. It would have happened in 2004 instead of 2008. Now, if it happened in 2004, again, maybe George Bush wouldn't have got reelected. But it would have been much better for the economy to have the bust in 2004 than 2008. Think about all the bad loans that took place between 2004 and 2008. Think about how many more subprime mortgages were taken out because the Fed gave the markets 4 more years to party on this cheap money. And it was all politics. And if you go back and you look at Ben Bernanke's television appearances, all the way up to 2007, every time he was asked a question about the housing bubble, he said, I reject your premise. There is no housing bubble. There's no evidence of a housing bubble. It's wrong. This was the Federal Reserve. This is our top guy. Even in 07, 08, saying that there was no housing bubble. In fact, Ben Bernanke said that it was not even possible for home prices to fall. It wasn't even, when he was asked questions about what would happen if real estate prices fell, he said, well, they can't fall, so it's a ridiculous question. Why should I even answer it? But even hypothetically, he said, well, even if real estate prices fall, it's not going to affect the economy. It's not going to affect employment. This is the Federal Reserve. This is Ben Bernanke saying this stuff. Now, of course, do you think he was just grossly incompetent? Or he was lying? See, I think it's more likely that he was lying. I think he's a smart guy. And he knew how big the housing bubble was, again, but he knew how important it was to keep the phony economy going. So he was trying to confuse the market. He was trying to placate the market, tell the market that there was nothing to worry about. Right? Keep on borrowing, keep on spending, re-elect George Bush, nothing to worry about. Everything is great. And the market believed it until it fell apart. Now, when the financial crisis hit, and the banks started to go out of business, and all the people that had financed these mortgages, and this is all the stuff that I wrote was going to happen in Crash Proof. And Barack Obama, of course, gets elected because he's pointing all the problems and blaming it on Bush, and Bush was culpable, no question about it, but the Fed was more to blame. But Obama is saying, look, this is because of capitalism. There wasn't enough government. There was too much free market capitalism. There was too much greed, on Wall Street. And, even George Bush admitted, or he said, that Wall Street got drunk. And Obama somehow thought, well, yeah, they were drunk on capitalism. They weren't. They were drunk on cheap money. And what George Bush didn't understand, or didn't bother to figure it out, or ask himself the question, where did everybody on Wall Street get all this alcohol? How'd they get so drunk? And it wasn't just Wall Street that was drunk, the whole country was acting drunk. And the alcohol came from the Federal Reserve. And Greenspan was the bartender, and then Bernanke, that's what liquored everybody up. And that's why they acted so recklessly. It wasn't the free market. The free market wouldn't have given us a housing bubble. The free market would have prevented a housing bubble. All these loans couldn't have been originated in a free market. It was only because we had no free market. It was only because the government was artificially redirecting loans to places they never would have been made. Based on artificially low rates and government subsidies, the government funneled all this money into the housing market. That's what happened. And then it blew up. But what is Obama's solution? Did President Obama learn anything from the mistakes of George Bush? No. Did Ben Bernanke learn anything from the mistakes of Alan Greenspan? No, because they're repeating every one. The only difference is they're making the same mistakes on a grander scale. Bush decided to run Keynesian-style deficits to try to artificially stimulate the economy. We're doing the same thing under Obama, except the deficits are 5 times as big. Instead of $300 billion, it's $1.5 trillion. Ben Bernanke, did he learn a lesson and say, gee, Alan Greenspan kept interest rates too low for too long? No. Ben Bernanke's solution was, I'm going to keep rates even lower for even longer. And now you got to think, okay, the result of the monetary and fiscal stimulus under Bush and Greenspan was the housing bubble and the financial crisis, and we barely averted the biggest economic collapse since the Great Depression because of what that monetary and fiscal policy produced. When that stimulus wore off, that's how bad the hangover was. Now, instead of dealing with the problems, we decided to have more of that stimulus, only on a bigger scale. So think about this. It was so bad in 2008, based on 1% interest rates for a couple of years, or the Fed raising rates very slowly, because when the Fed started to raise rates, they did it too slowly. It was a quarter point every couple of months. So they brought it down to 1%, they raised them too slow, and we had $300 billion deficits. And we just narrowly avoided the Great Depression. Well, what is awaiting our future? Based on this, what is it going to look like when this stimulus wears off? What is the next crisis that our leaders are in the process of creating, and how bad is it going to be? Because we didn't avoid a repeat of the Great Depression. Right? We just postponed it and assured it. And in fact, it's not even going to be a repeat of the Great Depression. Because in hindsight, the Great Depression isn't going to look so great next to what we're going to go through. In fact, it might look closer to the Roaring '20s than the Great Depression. That's how bad it's going to be because we refuse to deal with this problem. We continuously kick that can down the road, but the problem is when you're out of road, and the can is now enormous, right? What happens? Nothing. You got to deal with that can, and that's where the next crisis is coming. And I even wrote about this in Crash Proof, because when I wrote Crash Proof, I forecast that the government would repeat these mistakes and try to artificially revive the economy after the housing bubble burst, much the way that it's done. And it was the crash that followed that crash that I was worried about in Crash Proof. It wasn't the first one. It was the next one, which is the one that's coming and which is the subject of the new book. But, so what is this crash going to look like? Well, the first bubble we had in these series of bubbles, we had a stock market bubble. Too much cheap money from the Fed went into the stock market. You saw the consequence there, all these crazy startups, and that bubble burst, and then the money went into the housing market. And the Fed tries to claim that, well, we didn't cause the housing bubble because the housing bubble started, housing prices started to go up in 1996, right? So how could we have caused it in 2000? No. The reason that housing prices were going up back then was money was too cheap back then as well. And in fact, a lot of the money that was being made in the stock market bubble was used to buy real estate. So the real estate bubble really started before the stock market bubble burst. But the Fed created both the stock market bubble and the housing bubble because they were both a consequence of cheap money. It's just that the stock market bubble got bigger faster and flamed out first. And when the stock market bubble burst, a lot of that speculation flowed into the yet-to-burst real estate bubble that only got a lot bigger based on all the fuel that the Fed threw on the real estate market after the stock market bubble burst. And maybe the Fed's intention was to try to revive the stock market, but what it really revived or threw gasoline on the flames of the housing bubble. So the second bubble was in housing. All that cheap money went into real estate. Where is this bubble now? Where is all this cheap money that the Fed is creating going? What is the bubble that is being created right now? Well, I call it the government bubble. That's where it's going. The money is going to the government. The government is spending a tremendous amount of money. I mean, the government budget now is almost $4 trillion a year. It's an enormous amount of government spending. Where's it getting the money? From the Federal Reserve. In fact, the government's even cut taxes. They cut payroll taxes. Social Security now pays out more in benefits than it collects in taxes. I mean, where's all this money coming from? It's coming from the Fed. The Fed has enabled tax cuts and massive increases in government spending. You can see the bubble in the bond market. I mean, the number of outstanding Treasury bonds has exploded, yet the prices are still sky high. People are buying 10-year government bonds and accepting a coupon of 1.8. The inflation rate is twice that, even the inflation rate that the government admits to. Forget about what it actually is. Nobody would buy these bonds. I mean, this obviously is a bubble. Who's buying them? Central banks. Central banks all around the world, and in particular, the U.S. Central Bank. The Federal Reserve now has been buying, I think, 90% of all the long-term treasuries that are sold. Take the Fed out of the market, what happens to price? Price collapses. So this is a bubble of government spending based on debt that is only sustainable as long as interest rates stay low. Now the question is, can interest rates stay low indefinitely? Because there's a lot of people that think they can. See, they're the same people that thought real estate prices would rise indefinitely. See, the problem's going to happen when interest rates start to rise. People think that the U.S. economy is recovering. Well, if it's recovering, why are interest rates still zero? If it really is recovering, how can we need the economy on life support? See, there are people who have said, look at the 0% interest rates, and they say they're the equivalent of a training wheel, that the economy needed the training wheels until it got going on its own, and they don't understand why the Fed won't remove those training wheels, because after all, the economy seems to be motoring along well. Why do we need the training wheels? See, I think the Fed is not taking those training wheels off because they understand that they're not the training wheels. They are the only wheels. And if you take away the stimulus, right, the bike is going to fall over because it can't run without wheels. That being said, we better take those training wheels off, even if it means the bike falls over, because if we keep the training wheels on, we're about to go over the edge of a cliff. And if we ride this bike over that cliff, we're not going to survive. If we just take off the wheels and have an accident, we probably will survive. We might get a little, black and blue from the fall, but we're not going to die like we will if we go over the cliff, at least economically speaking. But the Fed doesn't care about that. It's just like it was during the housing bubble. The Fed didn't care that there was a housing bubble. It deliberately covered up the fact that there was a housing bubble because it didn't want to have to deal with the consequences of pricking it. The government knows this is a phony recovery. The Fed rather knows this is a phony recovery, but it doesn't care. Because the people voting to re-elect Obama, they're not going to care because they don't know the difference. They don't want, so the Fed wants to make sure everybody is under the false impression that things are getting better. And I said, well, why is Ben Bernanke so partisan? Why does he want to help Obama? He doesn't want to help Obama per se. He just wants to help whoever the incumbent is. Because that's what they perceive the Fed's job to be, to help the incumbents get reelected from either party. Because you know what, if Mitt Romney wins, now he's the incumbent. And now Ben Bernanke can say, I'm going to help you get reelected just as much as I helped your predecessor. So reappoint me, right? They always want to prove to their next boss that they're going to be just as loyal as they were to their past boss. So it's all about postponing the pain. No one cares about actually solving the problems, or if in postponing the pain, we make the pain worse because we exacerbate the problems. So what's going to happen when interest rates rise? And why is the Fed so afraid to raise them? Well, just look at Greece. Look at Europe. Why is there a sovereign debt crisis in Europe? Because interest rates went up. If European interest rates were still at record lows, we wouldn't be talking about any of the problems in Europe. The only reason that European nations got in trouble was because interest rates rose. Now, why did they rise? Well, they rose because the people who had been lending the money at low rates of interest had a second thought. And they began to be worried. Maybe somebody that was buying Greek bonds, all of a sudden they thought, can the Greeks actually pay this money back? Maybe, I don't think they can. Now they don't want to buy the bonds anymore. And then all of a sudden interest rates go up. And as interest rates go up, the government can't afford to pay the interest, and now it really starts to implode because it exposes the fundamental problem. See, when rates are still low and nobody is caring about anything, okay, they can keep on borrowing. I mean, Greece is no more in debt now than it was a few years ago. The problem is they can't afford the interest payments now. They had just as much debt. Greece was just as broke a few years ago. The difference is back then no one cared how broke they were. Now they care. And it affects their ability to borrow. So you have all these sovereign debt crises. Well, what about America? We are no more capable of paying our debts than most of the countries in Europe are. We have an enormous debt. Our debt is greater than our GDP. And that's if you just take the tip of the iceberg. That's just the bonds that have been sold. What about all the off-budget things that are not even included? Things like Fannie and Freddie. That's $6 trillion, $7 trillion worth of debt the government has guaranteed. Well, we're on the hook for that, just the way we're on the hook for the treasury bonds. That's still debt. What about student loans now? You heard about we have over $1 trillion in student loan debt. You think the students are good for that money? I don't think so. You think a guy with a $100,000 degree in sociology, think he's going to pay back that $100 grand? No. Where's the money going to come from? Government's going to have to pay. Same thing. What about Social Security? What about Medicare? Now I'm reading that the unfunded liabilities there are over $60 trillion. Where's that money coming from? We are dead broke. But right now, we can borrow money at zero. How much longer can we do that? Right? The people, the same politicians that told us that the subprime crisis was contained, right? The mortgage crisis was contained to subprime. They're the same people that are saying that the sovereign debt crisis is contained to Europe. It's not contained any more now than it was then. And if you remember back then, when the experts were trying to say that we shouldn't worry, experts like Ben Bernanke, who said that we shouldn't worry about the mortgage problem, that it wasn't going to spread, it was contained to subprime. Right? What I was saying at the time was, no, they're wrong. They don't understand the problem. It's not about containment or about spreading. The whole market was already sick, was already infected with the disease. It's just that subprime was the weaker link, and so the symptoms showed up there first. I just said, wait, you'll see how sick the whole mortgage market is. And eventually it happened. Well, that's the same thing now. It's not about, will the problems in Europe spread to America. America is actually sicker than Europe. But we're starting off, we've got a lot more slack. I mean, and the difference is we got a printing press. I think that's the only difference. People look at Greece or Portugal or Spain, and they realize that based on the treaty they have with the euro, the government just can't print money and buy bonds. And as a result, they actually have to sell these bonds to a willing buyer. And they're having their problem because rates are going up. The idea is that, well, America isn't in that predicament because we could just print money. The Fed can just print money and buy the bonds that nobody wants, and so therefore it's no problem. We will never have to default. Well, we might not default in the standard definition, but if we end up printing a bunch of money to buy bonds that nobody wants, we will end up defaulting through inflation. From our creditors' perspective, it's the same thing. Either under default, you don't get your money back at all, or you get back a percentage of your money. Like in Greece, they did a 50% haircut on Greek bonds. Now, I don't think the haircut is over. I think by the end of the day, they're going to get a crew cut on those bonds. And, maybe they'll get 10 cents on the dollar. I don't know. But in America, the idea is that we're never going to have to restructure the way Greece did. We'll just print. Well, let's say we did a restructuring and we imposed a 50% haircut on our creditors. They would only get back 50 cents on the dollar. But what if we don't do that? What if we just print so much money that the dollar loses 90% of its purchasing power? That's worse. You get all your money back, but you can only buy 10% of what you could when you made the loan. That's a lot worse than getting half your money back where the money maintains its value. So defaulting through inflation and defaulting through defaulting is basically the same impact on the lender, but it's a much worse impact on society in general. It is far worse for a nation, for its own people, to default through inflation than through a restructuring, a legitimate restructuring. And unfortunately, it's the latter. It's the inflationary default that we're probably looking at, and that is even worse. And how are these forces going to come into play? Well, at some point in the not-too-distant future, there will be pressure on the Fed to raise rates. Right now, they're not doing it, and they're hiding behind the idea that there's no inflation, which is laughable. Oil prices, gas prices are at record highs. Despite the fact that gasoline demand in America is like a 12-year low. Why is demand for gasoline plunging? Because so many people are unemployed, they don't need to drive. So we're not using a lot of gas. Meanwhile, gas production is the highest it's been. Yet prices are rising anyway. How can that be? Inflation is the only explanation. We're printing money faster than we're discovering oil. And we're printing it faster than we're discontinuing the use of it because the economy is so weak. So inflation is driving up the price of oil. Inflation is driving up the price of food. Yet the Federal Reserve claims there's no inflation. And in fact, it's interesting because politically, when people want to talk about Obama, they want to try to blame him for the high gas price, they always want to blame it on his energy policy. It's got nothing to do with his energy policy. It's his fiscal policy. It's the Fed's monetary policy that are driving energy prices. What does Obama want to do? He wants to investigate speculators. He wants to waste even more of our money to see if we can figure out which speculator is causing the price of oil to go up. You don't have to spend any money. It's the Federal Reserve. That's the speculator. That's what's doing it. So if you're worried about inflation, stop the Fed from printing money. But the only way to do that is to stop spending it. And Obama doesn't want to stop spending it. That's his economic plan. He wants to spend money. The consequence is inflation. So at some point, the public, the investing public, is going to force the Fed to have to raise rates to slow the inflation. They will not buy the propaganda. In fact, I just read an article last week that said that the government is about to fix the CPI again. And by fix, I mean, you fudge the numbers. The government is claiming, and I can say this with a straight face, the government is claiming that the CPI is overstating inflation, that it's actually even lower than they're telling us. Now, of course, that's exactly what they did in the 1990s that led to the last major revision of the CPI, which, as far as I'm concerned, rendered it completely worthless as an actual measure of the effects of inflation. But now they're saying they want to tinker with it again so they can get the number down even lower. Now, will the market buy it again as the Fed just goes in there and makes sure that nothing can possibly go up that's ever included in the CPI? That the only thing that's in there is stuff that went down, and if it didn't go down, they'll pretend it went down? I don't know, but at some point, the market is going to push pressure on the Fed. And the Fed, if it doesn't raise rates, will lose any credibility that it has left. And then there'll be a run on the dollar. What would happen if the Fed raised rates? Right? What if the Fed actually raised rates to fight inflation? What would happen? Well, three things are going to happen. All of them are horrific, which is why the Fed doesn't want to raise rates. One is the U.S. government. I mentioned it earlier, but the U.S. government will basically be forced to default, just like Greece, if rates go up. If the Fed were to let rates go up to where they need to be, there is no way that we can make the interest payments on the national debt. Forget about actually pay the debt off. I mean, if you think about it this way, in the next year, of our $15 trillion in funded debt, in the next year, about a third of it matures. That means we actually owe about $5-6 trillion that we're supposed to repay in the next year. How can we possibly pay that money back? I mean, the government only collects a little over $2 trillion a year in taxes. So we're obligated to repay triple what we collect in tax revenues. How are we going to do that? Well, of course, nobody actually thinks we're going to have to pay it off. Why? The plan is to borrow all that money and then use the money we borrowed to pay off the maturing bonds. Oh, okay, that's our plan. You know who had a plan just like that one? Bernie Madoff. And he's in jail now for 150 years because that was his plan too. And it worked for a while, just like our plan is working, until one day Bernie couldn't borrow enough money to pay off what he owed. Well, the same thing is going to happen to America. At some point, the people lending us this money aren't going to want to lend it anymore. I hear economists say that we can borrow forever. We never have to pay the money back. Try to think of that from the perspective of our creditors. So we can borrow forever. That means our creditors are going to lend us money forever without ever getting their money back. Why would they want to do that? I mean, what's in it for them? I mean, think about it from the position of a lender. When you're making a loan, what is the single most important part of that whole process? Getting paid back. Right? Because if you don't get paid back, what good was the loan? Right? So, of course, we have to pay them back. What we can't. And if they want their money back, the only way we can entice them is by offering them higher and higher rates. The problem is, where's that money going to come from? Right now, we're spending about $300 billion a year on interest on the national debt, despite the fact that interest rates are at zero. We're actually spending half as much on interest today as we did 10 years ago when the debt was half the size. What would happen if interest rates went to 5%, the average cost? And, the maturity is very short. Well, it would probably cost the U.S. government $1 trillion a year in interest payments instead of $300 billion. All right, where's it going to get the extra $700 billion? Where's that coming from? Well, they obviously can't borrow it because then if they had to borrow that extra $700, that would jack rates up even more. So what, are they going to slash spending on Social Security and defense? Are they going to massively increase taxes on the poor and the middle class? Because that's the only way to get the money. They're not going to get it by taxing the rich. They're going to have to tax the middle class and the poor. It's impossible. What if interest rates went to 10%? Now interest on the national debt consumes 100% of our tax revenue. That means all we can do is pay interest on the debt. We don't have money for anything else but interest on the national debt. And that's at 10%. Remember, interest rates went up to 20% under Paul Volcker. I mean, don't even try to do the math at 20%. So if debt goes up, if debt service payments go up, this whole thing implodes. The federal government's finances implode. Just like Bernie Madoff. In fact, we admitted that we're running a giant Ponzi scheme. If you remember, during the debt crisis negotiations, what did the President of the United States, what did the Secretary of the Treasury, head of the Federal Reserve, what did everybody say was going to happen if we didn't raise the debt ceiling? Everybody said we'd default. We'd default if we didn't raise the debt ceiling. What's that telling you? That's saying that our ability or willingness to pay our existing creditors is dependent on our ability to borrow more money from those same creditors. But if we can't go into debt, the party's over, we default. No, they didn't say, oh, if we don't raise the debt ceiling, we're going to slash government spending, we're going to have an across-the-board cut in federal pay and federal pensions and Social Security benefits. We're going to make sure we have money to pay our bondholders. They didn't say that. Or they didn't say we're going to have an emergency supplemental increase in federal tax withholding rates so we can get extra tax revenue so that we can pay off our bondholders. No. We told the bondholders, hey, you're low man on the totem pole. If we can't borrow any more money, you're out of luck. That's what we told them. That's not a good idea. If you're running a Ponzi scheme, you want to keep it quiet. You don't want to let the people know that it's a Ponzi scheme. But now they know. If they didn't know before, they know now. Because that was a lending ceiling, or a debt ceiling. What happens when we hit the lending ceiling? See, the lending ceiling is when the lenders don't want to loan us any more money. They have enough treasuries, thank you, I don't want any more, so just let me have my money when my bond matures. Right? That's a lending ceiling. Well, we're going to default. We've already established that. That's the fact. So, from that perspective, foreigners, they're not going to want to keep lending us money when they know that eventually we're going to default. So the Federal Reserve knows if they raise interest rates, they bring on a financial crisis, a sovereign debt crisis for the federal government. Not only the federal government, what about the states? A lot of the states will be bankrupted if interest rates go up. So government finances will implode. So they have to keep interest rates low. In fact, we are so addicted now to cheap money. The government debt is so low that all they can afford is zero. I don't even think the U.S. government can handle 1% Fed funds rate. That's how addicted we are to this cheap money, that if you even take away a little teeny bit of it, we're going to have convulsions. So the Fed has got to keep rates at zero. Now, what about the banks? Remember all these banks that we bailed out with TARP? What would happen to them if the Fed had to bring interest rates up to 5 or 6%? I would say that every major bank that we bailed out would fail again, only bigger. Citigroup, B of A, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley would collapse if interest rates went up. In fact, I think the Federal Reserve is so petrified that banks would collapse when interest rates went up, that when it deliberately gave the banks stress tests to pass, the one thing it didn't ask them to calculate was rising interest rates. They basically said, we want the banks to run these stress tests on what would happen if the stock market collapsed. Okay, but that already happened. All right, well, run a test anyway. Then they said, we want you to test your balance sheets for a real estate market collapse. All right, but did that just happen? I mean, why are we testing the things that have already happened? Why don't we look into the future and try to figure out what else might go wrong and then test that? Because the one bubble that is yet to burst is the bond market bubble. So why didn't the Fed say, do a stress test on a bursting of the bond market bubble? Because they knew all the banks would fail that test. In fact, if you look at the stress tests that the banks were given, under all scenarios, 10-year yields stay below 2%. What kind of stress is that? What if they were at 10%? What if they were at 20%? Crunch those numbers. See how the banks survive that. You know how the banks are making money right now? They borrow from the Fed at practically nothing, and then they loan to the government. They buy treasuries, they buy mortgages, right? And they live off the spread. And they lever it up. What happens if the source of the funds goes from quarter basis, 25 basis points, 30, whatever they're 50 basis points, to 5% or 6%? With all their cash flow turns negative. If you're collecting 3% on a treasury, that's great when I'm paying 0.25% to borrow the money. What if I'm paying 5% to borrow the money? 5 is bigger than 3. That's a big loss, especially when you're levered up. And what about my balance sheet? I got this 10-year treasury that's yielding 3%, but the brand new ones are yielding 5%. So what's mine worth? 70 cents on the dollar? 60 cents on the dollar? And what about my mortgages? Which brings me to the third leg of the stool that higher interest rates would knock out, and that's the housing market. Think about the housing market. It's on life support. Prices are still going down despite the lowest interest rates, mortgage interest rates in history. Ever. And if you actually adjust for inflation, the mortgage rates are negative. They're negative. And a lot of people are still buying mortgages now. Something like a third of all the mortgages are FHA, which used to be very small. Now it's like a third of them. These are 3.5% down. In fact, the entire subprime market didn't go away. It's just in the FHA. They decided that was a great market. They wanted to quarter it. Since everybody else went broke, they figured they would do it. And so, they've cornered that market and loaning money to people who can't pay you back with no collateral. And so we own that market as taxpayers. But imagine what would happen to the housing market if interest rates went up to 5%, which is still not high. Mortgage rates would probably be 6, 7%. Well, that's double where they are now. Triple for some people. I mean, if you're taking out a 5-year ARM right now, you can get a mortgage rate in the 2s. So what would happen to the real estate market if you drastically increased the cost of making your mortgage payments? Real estate prices would drop like a stone, even from where they are right now. And so that would collapse the banks. What about, all the big banks, like Bank of America, they are still valuing all their home equity loans at par, even though the underlying properties are underwater on the first mortgage, and they're holding the second mortgage, where in an economic downturn, they don't have a prayer of collecting 0, but they're still pretending it's worth par. So you have all these second mortgages and home equity loans that would collapse. I mean, the banks would all fail. And you got to think about this. The last time when the banks failed, the government bailed them out or prevented them from failing. And so the bondholders didn't lose any money, and more importantly, the depositors didn't lose any money. What would happen to a bank collapse where the Fed was tightening and not easing, right? Because the Fed can only bail out the banks if it's easing. But if it's in tightening mode, because there's inflation and they're having to tighten and the banks fail, the Fed can't bail them out. The government can't bail them out. The government needs a bailout itself. The government is broke. The government can't sell its own bonds, let alone bail out the banks. So if there's no bailout, not only do the banks fail, not only do the bondholders lose money, but the depositors lose money. Imagine that. The depositors would lose money because the FDIC would fail too. And without the Fed to replenish the FDIC, there is no FDIC. If Bank of America failed, there's not enough money in the FDIC right now to pay off the depositors, not even close. So that's just one bank. So the Fed knows if it brings interest rates up, it's economic Armageddon. Right? And that's why it can't raise them, because it doesn't want to deal with that problem. So it is going to print money and buy bonds and deny that there's inflation as long as it possibly can. Just like it did the same thing with the housing market. It kept printing money and buying up mortgages and denied there was a housing bubble right up until after it burst. And even then, they still were denying it. It took a while before they finally admitted that it was there. But then, of course, they absolved themselves of any responsibility and said nobody could have possibly predicted it. It was, a 100-year flood. And if it was anybody's fault, it was because we had too much capitalism and not enough regulation. But they're going to try to avoid this. But they can't avoid it forever. Because what happens? As the evidence mounts of more inflation, and the Fed does nothing but deny there's inflation, the Fed loses remaining credibility, which means there's even less demand for our treasuries. Now, the Fed then has to pick up the quantitative easing. Of course, that's the new name now. Quantitative easing is a new name for printing money. And the Fed just likes that because it sounds better, right? If the Fed just says, look, we're printing money, we're monetizing debt, that doesn't sound too good, right? If they say we're doing quantitative easing, I mean, quantitative, that sounds good. Everybody likes things to be easy, right? It's better than hard. So if it's quantitatively easy, it must really be good for us. So they're doing the quantitative easy, but they got to do more of it. Well, here's the problem. The problem is, the more money the Fed prints to buy these bonds, the more inflation it creates in the process, and the less the bonds they're buying are worth. And not only the bonds they're buying, but the bonds everybody else is stupid enough to be holding on to. So now as the Fed prints money to buy bonds, that means they have to print even more money to buy more bonds when people figure out what they're doing. But it's not just treasuries, it's all bonds. Let's say I own a corporate bond, and it's paying 5%. But I see the Fed is creating all this inflation, and I think the real rate of inflation is 15%, even though the CPI says it's 2%. My eyes tell me it's 15%. Am I going to want to hold on to this corporate bond that's yielding 5%? No, I'm going to sell it. Everyone's going to want to sell that corporate bonds. Now, the Fed can't just let corporate interest rates skyrocket. So what's it going to do? Now they have to start buying up corporate bonds. They have to start adding corporate bonds to their balance sheet. What about the municipalities? Is the state of New York going to be able to sell muni bonds at 4 or 5% if inflation's at 15%? No. So how is the Federal Reserve going to stop the municipal bonds from rising? Because if municipal rates went up to 10 or 15%, New York would default. So would California. So would a lot of big states. The Fed's not going to let that happen. So the Fed's got to buy up the muni bonds. But again, all along the process, the Fed starts buying up everything, which means the money supply is skyrocketing in order for the Fed to buy up all the bonds that nobody wants because the Fed refuses to let interest rates go up. See, the only thing that would cause me to want to buy a bond is if they gave me a high enough interest to compensate for all the inflation rates. But if the Fed is not letting rates go up, then I don't want the bond because I'm not getting paid to offset the risk of holding it. And then the whole thing is going to unravel and we're going to have hyperinflation. And the only way the government can stop it is to dramatically let rates go up. But of course, the longer they wait to do it, the worse it is. Because the more debts we accumulate, the higher the rates have to go. It's like the more stimulus that the Fed injects into the economy, the worse the hangover is when they stop the process. But if they're so afraid of taking the stimulus away, then we die of an overdose of the stuff, and that's hyperinflation. And that is the worst case scenario. But under hyperinflation, the dollar is worthless. You're talking about Zimbabwe, Weimar Republic, Germany, Argentina, and that is a complete unmitigated disaster, which will have enormous political consequences on our individual liberty, on our rights as Americans. I mean, look at all the liberties we're losing now when things are relatively good. Imagine what will be left of the Constitution when things are as bad as they're about to get if we have hyperinflation or even narrowly avoid it based on rates that go up much, much later than they should have. But there is not going to be any easy way out of this. And people I hear all the time, well, gee, if it's going to be this bad, it's going to take the whole world down. Right? I mean, you're telling me, well, let's invest abroad. If we have this collapse in America, it's going to bring down the entire planet. Well, a lot of people still haven't figured out that the problem for the global economy is not the collapse of the American economy, it's the postponement of that collapse. What is hurting the global economy is trying to prop up the U.S. economy. Because we are exporting all these costs to our trading partners. America lives beyond its means. Why? Because there's a whole bunch of people that live beneath their means. You have a lot of people in other countries that are making all the products that we consume, that are saving all the money that we borrow. Our short-term gain is their short-term loss, because we're enjoying the fruits of their labor. And I hear people all the time, well, China needs America because they need all the jobs. What do they need the jobs for? If we get all the stuff, what good are the jobs? I mean, if that's the way you think, then you should have said that the emancipation of the slaves during the Civil War was a bad deal for the slaves because they were all unemployed. Yeah, at least under slavery they had jobs. You should have been glad they had full employment, right? There was full employment among the slaves. Well, the problem wasn't that they had a job. The problem was that they didn't get the fruits of their labor. The fruits of their labor belonged to the master, right? Jobs are not an end; they are a means. The reason we want a job is not because we want to work. It's because we want the stuff that we can buy for the money we earn because we work. In China, have all these people working, But we're getting the benefit of what they produce. The Chinese are sitting on over $3 trillion in foreign exchange, over $2 trillion of which is U.S. treasuries. The argument is, well, if we stop buying, China's economy implodes, their factories shut down, all their people are out of jobs. That's nonsense. You know, economists made that exact analysis in America during the Second World War. Or as the Second World War was ending, America's Keynesian economists were afraid that if the war ended, we would go into a depression. Why? Well, we had 10 million soldiers who were about to be unemployed. We had all these factories that were making bombs and stuff for the war, and if the war ended, what would all these factories do? And what about all the workers who are making these bombs? They're all going to be unemployed. And the economists were actually worried about this. Now, of course, or fortunately, we didn't take any of their advice, and we ended the war, and lo and behold, instead of a depression, we had a boom. The post-war boom. In fact, there are people who think that it was the Second World War that ended the Depression. They're wrong. The Depression did not end until after the war ended. And of course, the reason we had a depression was because of government. And I don't know if I have enough time to get into that here, but it was all the bad policies of Hoover and Roosevelt that created it. But we didn't ultimately get out of the depression until after the war. And why? It was because government spending collapsed after the war, and taxes were cut significantly, and it was a reduction of the size of government that unleashed the free market forces that gave us that post-war boom. But what happened to the 10 million soldiers that lost their jobs killing people? Well, they found jobs doing stuff that didn't kill people. And lo and behold, we were better off as a society because our young men weren't using their labor to fight in foreign shores. They were using their labor back here to make things that we all enjoyed. And what about all the factories that were for producing bombs? Well, they started producing things that didn't explode. And those are the things that we really want. Instead of making tanks, they made automobiles. And instead of making jet fighters, they made commercial aircraft. They made more washing machines, more dishwashers, more vacuum cleaners, things that made our lives better. Televisions, radios, whatever it was. We started making it. In fact, we started making so many of them. We had huge surpluses. We exported them all around the world. But we had a boom because we retooled. The same thing is going to happen in countries like China. And people think that, Americans are unique in our ability to want things, our demand or our desire. I brought my 9-year-old son here with me. I don't have to stimulate his demand. Take him into a toy store, he wants everything. I want that, I want this, give me that. He doesn't need any stimulus. Demand is infinite. Everybody wants stuff. The people in China are no different. They want all the things that we want. You would think that there's somebody in China who's on a production line, and let's say he's making a washing machine for clothing, and he's working on it all day long. He does nothing but make washing machines. And you think he's thinking in his head, why do the Americans want these things? Don't they realize you can wash your clothes by hand? And don't they have any streams down in America? And what do they want these dryers for? Don't they know about clothing pins? Of course they want these things. They just can't afford it because the government is suppressing the value of the RMB, so it keeps the purchasing power of their wages down. So instead of enjoying the fruits of their labor, they export the fruits of our labor to America. We get the washing machines without having to make them. They get stuck making them, and they don't mind them. If the Chinese allow their currency to rise, prices in China would collapse for everything. And the Chinese would just start buying all the things that they're now exporting to us. See, people say China has an export economy. No, they don't. It's a manufacturing economy. They don't have to export what they manufacture. They can consume what they manufacture. And if they did, they would be better off. And what that is deflation. That's what China needs, is a nice healthy dose of deflation. But instead, they create massive inflation to prop up our economy. And I'm going to say a couple words on this, and then I'll open up to questions. But the economists keep telling us, too, we got to fight. We can't have deflation. We have to keep printing all this money, because if we have deflation, then it's all over for us. It's like probably the next worst thing to get hit by a gigantic meteor is that we have deflation. And, what is deflation? Well, deflation, at least the way the government looks at it, is when the cost of all the things that we want to buy goes down. So like if we can buy things cheaper, then that's a bad thing. Right? If energy gets less expensive, if education costs went down, if healthcare costs went down, all that stuff is bad, apparently. And the government has to make sure that that doesn't happen by creating just enough inflation to prevent it. In fact, they're so scared of deflation that the Fed deliberately creates more inflation just so we don't have the danger of that happening. Because if you remember, when the Federal Reserve was first created, or they adopted the mantra of price stability. They told us that we want the Fed to have price stability because, of course, before the Fed, in the 100 or so years before the Fed, we had deflation. Right? Prices were a lot lower in 1900 than they were in 1800. Right? Just like, our grandparents would tell us, when I was your age, this is what used to cost a quarter. Now, they always tell you about how cheap things were when they were young. Well, our great-great-grandparents, when they had those conversations with their grandparents, it was the other way. Hell, when I was your age, this cost twice as much. Prices went down during the 19th century. But the Federal Reserve said, that's no good. We want price stability. We want prices to stay the same, as if somehow that's better than prices going down. See, now the new Fed, they don't even want price stability. Price stability is bad now. And why is price stability bad? Because we're too close, there's too much danger that prices might actually fall. So we don't want stable prices. Now the goal of the Fed is rising prices. Now, think about this. Think about how much prices went up when the Fed goal was stability. Imagine how much more they're going to go up now when that's the policy. Right? I mean, since the Federal Reserve was created, the dollar has lost better than 95% of its purchasing power, when the goal was stable purchasing power. Think of how much it's going to lose when the goal is to make it lose purchasing power. But coming back to this whole concept of deflation, why is that bad? Right? I mean, why are costs going down bad? Well, the government tells us that, well, it's bad because if the price goes down, nobody will buy. See, demand will go away. No one's going to buy a product if they think that they might be able to buy it cheaper a year from now. Okay, well then why does anybody buy a cell phone? Why does anybody buy a computer? Why does anybody buy a television set? They go down every year. So, what happens in the world doesn't back up that theory. In fact, anybody who owns a small retail store knows that's not true. If you have a bunch of stuff and you want to sell it really quick, what do? They have a sale. What's a sale? That means when you lower the price. So you lower the price, and that means people want to buy even more. Right? If they had a sale where they said, hey, a sale today, 10% more, how many people are going to show up for that sale? It's lower prices that makes people want to buy. It's the exact opposite of what the government says. I mean, the first cell phone, if you remember the first cell phones, I think they probably were about $2,500, $3,000 a piece. They were pretty big. They were like this, the ones you can travel with. How many people bought those things? A few rich people bought them as a novelty, because, they didn't even work they weren't paying so you could even use them, and it cost a fortune to even use it. It was more of a conversation piece for the rich guy. Hey, look, I got a phone here. Look what I can do. I can make a call. But what is it that created all the demand? Because now everybody's got cell phones. Kids in junior high school, elementary school have cell phones. Why do we all have cell phones? Because they're so cheap. Why did they get cheap? Because the prices went down. It was the falling prices that created all the demand. Imagine if the first cell phone was the cheapest cell phone. Would anybody have one today? And that's the same thing for television sets or radios. They start off cheap, and they start off expensive, and they get cheap. And the process is deflation, right? It's prices coming down. So prices coming down is a great thing, but the government has convinced us that it's a lousy thing. Well, when we have deflation in China, all of a sudden the Chinese are going to buy all sorts of stuff that they can't afford now. They're going to buy the washing machines, the dryers. They're going to buy the cars. They're going to buy all the things that they're shipping to us. You know what that means? They're going to buy a lot more gasoline too, because when they start buying more cars, they're going to need more gas. And of course, gas is going to get cheaper too. When the Chinese currency goes up in value, gas gets a lot cheaper for them. So does the steel that they need to make the cars. But of course, as everything gets less expensive for the Chinese, it gets more expensive for us. That's what's going to happen. See, we've been living in this fool's paradise. We've enjoyed this artificial standard of living that we're not entitled to based on our productivity. We're spending what everybody else produces. We're buying what they make. We're borrowing what they save. Our ride on the global gravy train is coming to an end. It's all possible because the dollar is the reserve currency, but it is impossible for the dollar to maintain that status. You can't be the reserve currency when you're printing money like crazy and have 0% interest rates. I mean, right now, the dollar has bought some time because of Europe. You know, it's kind of ironic that a lot of politicians are trying to blame our problems on Europe, kind of like a scapegoat. Oh, well, you know, we'd have a better recovery, but Europe is dragging us down. It's actually the opposite. We are benefiting from the European fears right now. The worst thing that can happen to the U.S. economy, if you want to maintain this phony recovery, the worst thing would be that Europe solves their problems. We couldn't possibly survive that. Because people are so worried about Europe, they're buying treasuries. They're buying dollars. So that's helping to keep the interest rates low. That's helping to keep consumer prices much lower. I mean, imagine how expensive oil would be if the euro was at 150 instead of 130, or 170, or $2, or other currencies were rising. So right now, that's the best thing we got going for us, is that people think Europe is in even worse shape. The truth is, Europe is not in worse shape. They're in better shape. People just haven't figured that out yet. Because we haven't been forced to deal with the crisis yet. But we will. But when this happens, and I think when the dollar collapses, there's going to be a massive change in the global hierarchy, in purchasing power. A lot of these emerging economies that have been producing everything and saving, they're going to see massive increases in their relative standards of living, their consumption, and there's going to be a lot of money to be made there for people who are positioned properly. You want to be invested in the countries that are going to gain what we lose. You want to own the currencies that are going to gain the purchasing power that the dollar loses. See, everything that's produced is still going to be produced. The factories are still there. The consumer goods are going to keep on coming. The only question is, who gets them? Who's going to get to enjoy them? See, right now it's America. We buy a disproportionate percentage of all that stuff. That's going to change. We're going to buy a lot less of it. Americans are going to be much poorer than they are today. Other people are going to be richer. Now, over time, yes, you know, standard of living could rise for everybody, but on a relative basis, America is going to see a sharp reduction in its standard of living relative to standards of living of other people in other countries. And the key is to recognize that shift and just make sure that your assets and your investments reflect the world the way it's going to look, not the way it looks now or the way it looked in the past. And that's owning the right currencies, owning the right stocks, making sure that you don't have a lot of US dollars. I mean, the bond bubble is this last bubble to burst. The bond bubble and the dollar bubble are pretty much one and the same. They're almost mirror images of each other. Because when the dollar collapses, it's still bonds. Because all bonds are future promises to pay you dollars. And so the only thing worse, I think, than having a dollar today is having a promise to be paid a dollar in the future, because the future dollar will be worth a lot less. So you don't want to own dollars. You don't want to own, I think most U.S. assets are going to be too risky to own, even real things. Because on a relative basis, you'd still be better off if you own those assets abroad. And I think the last thing I'm going to say, and I'm going to open up for questions, is the other part that really scares me about all this is the politics. Because the government was very successful, at least thus far, when everything collapsed in 2008. The government was successful in blaming capitalism, blaming greed, a lack of regulation, and so we got more government, more regulation, we gave the Fed even more power, and as a result, this power was being used in an even more destructive manner than before. And the fear is, what's next? I mean, because this next crisis is going to be so much worse, what's going to happen? How much more power will be usurped by the government in the name of solving problems that government created? Or is there a way that we can finally hold the government accountable for these disasters and to actually have solutions that will work, to actually cage government, shrink government, and roll back all these rules and regulations, get rid of a lot of this government spending, and unleash the free market forces that initially made the country so rich in the first place? I mean, we are in a gigantic ditch. We're never going to get out of it if we repeat the mistakes that placed us in it. I mean, we have to go back to the policies of the past that made us rich enough to afford to dig that ditch. So I don't know. I mean, I still have concerns. I have concerns over laws the government might pass. I mean, the government is already cracking down on Americans who put their money abroad. It's almost impossible now for American citizens to open foreign bank accounts. Foreign banks won't take us. Now they just have a new proposal. I don't know if it's passed yet, but that says if you owe back taxes, the IRS can take your passport. So you can't leave the country. That one it's in some transportation bill. I don't know if it's been passed yet, but it's probably sailing right through. They actually increased the cost. They already have big exit taxes. If you want to leave America now and you have some financial assets, you've got to pay a huge tax to give up your citizenship, because you basically have to assume you liquidate all your taxes, and you have to pay ordinary income taxes on all the gains, even if you haven't realized them. So it's a horrific penalty. But it used to be if you were just young and poor, it didn't cost you anything to give up your citizenship. You could just renounce it if you wanted to. Now it costs you $500. There was a form, and if you want to renounce your citizenship, you have to get a form. The form used to be free. Now it's the most expensive form they produce. It's like a $500 form to renounce your citizenship. Now, $500 might not sound like a lot. Well, it's a lot to some people, but it's not zero. And if they can make it $5,000, they can make it $5,000. They can make it $50,000. They can make it impossible for you to renounce your citizenship. And they can raise taxes so high, and they can make it impossible for you to leave. I mean, it's like they're building a wall. When I ran for Senate a couple of years ago, and the discussion used to come up about building a wall, on our southern border to keep the Mexicans out. And I always said, I don't want to build that wall, because they'll use it to keep the Americans in. And this is what they're having. As they turn up the heat, more regulation, more taxes, more inflation, the best and the brightest are going to want to leave. And, instead of the government trying to figure out why the best and the brightest want out, right, they might just try to figure out ways to prevent them from leaving. I mean, the way it worked in the Soviet Union is, well, if they saw you trying to get out, they killed you, right? Is it going to get that bad? I mean, we had the Berlin Wall was there, right? That wall was there to keep people in. Are we going to do that? That's I tell people too when they buy gold. We keep a lot of gold offshore. We have a lot of clients that keep gold in the Perth Mint, because maybe they might not say it's illegal to leave. They just might say it's illegal to leave with your gold. You can't take gold out of the country. You can't take foreign exchange out of the country. So you got to get that stuff out of the country now. Now it's hard. You can't open a foreign bank account. No one will take it. You can still store your gold offshore, but who knows? Maybe they'll make it so that you can't do that either. It's just kind of incremental. It's just one step at a time. But it seems to me that the government is preparing to try to keep people in, and I think they're going to try to keep capital in, which is another reason why you want to make these investments fast. You want to get your dollars converted into other currencies and other assets while you can still do it, before they impose huge transaction tax. The government can put a big tax. If you want to buy Swiss francs, you want to buy Canadian dollars, they can put a 20% tax. They can put a 50% tax. They can put a 100% tax. They can make it illegal. They can do whatever they want. And as things get worse, there's going to be more political pressure to do those things. But anyway, let me just open it up to your questions, because I think I've already been talking for over an hour. But how long have I been talking? Hour 15. Yeah, that's about it. Okay. All right, so is there 2 microphones? I can't really see it. All right, so I'll start on that line because it's longer. Go ahead.
Check, it's on.
Yes, I've been buying gold and silver for about a year now. My question is, the bull run in the late 70s with gold, where there was inflation that was noticeable, I didn't look through that. Compared to the bull run today, where everybody seems to be selling their gold. I seem to be the only one buying it, but it is pretty damn expensive. And do you believe the market's manipulated? Because I hear a lot of that.
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's manipulated. I mean, clearly, central banks want the price of gold to be down. The lower the better, because a rising gold price exposes that their monetary policy is too easy. So it's like if you're trying to kill the coal miners, and you want to put gas down there in the mine, you want to try to keep the canaries alive as long as possible, so the coal miners won't leave, right? So gold is like the canary in the monetary coal mine. And so I can certainly see why the central banks would want to suppress the price, but whether they can actually do it, I don't know. Certainly if they're trying to suppress it, they haven't done a very good job. I mean, it's at $1,600 an ounce. It was at $300 an ounce a decade ago. So maybe it would be at $3,000 an ounce if they weren't trying to suppress it. But even if they're trying, they're not succeeding. The price is rising anyway. But, I think we have a long way to go. I think there's a tremendous amount of bearishness and negativity. A lot, in the last week or two, most of the major gold stocks have hit 52-week lows. I mean, most gold stocks now, the big ones, are trading at 8, 9, 10 times earnings. They're trading at prices that they haven't seen since gold was $700 an ounce. How can gold stocks have not gained any value on a tripling in the price of gold, or doubling, whatever, in the price of gold? I think there's massive negativity built into the market. I mean, it's the opposite of a bubble. In a bubble, everybody is wildly optimistic. In the precious metals market, all the speculators are very pessimistic. Everybody is waiting for the gold price to collapse. Meanwhile, it keeps going up, despite the fact that everybody is waiting for it to collapse. That's not a bubble. You have a lot of people saying, oh, gold's a bubble because there's a lot of people talking about gold. Well, first of all, there's not a lot of people talking about gold. I mean, I suppose if you're defining a lot of people as, the people on CNBC, okay, yeah, they do talk about it. But that's a small universe, right? And meanwhile, most of those people who are talking about gold, they're not actually buying it, they're just talking about it. So you don't build a bubble on talk. The people who are talking about the gold bubble have got to start buying it before it's a bubble. And they'll say, well, look at all these commercials for gold. Yeah, there's commercials. If you watch cable, if you watch Fox Business or CNBC, do you see any commercials for gold dealers on American Idol? The public is not buying gold. There's a small section of people who are buying, and they're getting ripped off. I mean, the only reason that companies like Goldline can afford to advertise is because they mark their gold up 70% or more. So if people want to buy $10,000 worth of gold from Goldline and they send them $17,000 and Goldline takes $7,000, which is highway robbery, they can afford to buy those commercials. There are no legitimate firms advertising on television because they don't do enough volume to afford the ads. So you're talking about a tiny, tiny market. I've spoken to institutions, I've sat at tables with money managers where they collectively manage hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe even over $1 trillion in the same room. And I asked them, does anybody here, for your clients, do you own any gold stocks? No. Do you own any gold? No. Nobody owns any of it. So I think that's going to change. I think people still don't understand money, central banking, the predicament of the United States. They couldn't see the stock market bubble. They couldn't see the housing bubble. They can't see the bond bubble. But somehow they think they see a gold bubble. Right? There is no gold bubble. There might be one in the future, but we ain't there yet. Yeah.
Hey Peter, so for younger adults who have some assets besides gold and commodities and foreign exchange, what are some areas that you and your firm are looking to, like you were saying, some countries that you're looking to get into when your thesis does play out?
When it does, well, I mean, it's the same countries. I mean, we're investing in Asia, a lot of the resource countries. We're in Europe. We're in Scandinavia, Switzerland, but we have a lot of Norway and Sweden. We have some money in Latin America. We're diversified. We try to avoid the Eurozone countries. We don't have as much money in the Euro. We've underweighted Japan. We have some Japanese companies, but we've underweighted it. We have very little exposure to the UK. I mean, if you look at the conventional global approach, most of the money is in Europe, in the euro, in the pound, in the yen. We're focusing on other countries that have better monetary policy, better fiscal policy. policy, stronger currencies, better fundamentals. I mean, nobody is perfect. I mean, the problem is there's no, perfect capitalist society. I mean, you could look at Hong Kong or you could look at Singapore and say, yeah, they're a lot closer to the ideal, but they're not as close as we used to be, 100 years ago. So nobody's perfect. It's kind of like, you're trying to pick the least bad among the offenders. But there are countries that, that we own. And I think, the biggest innovation, I think, at my company in the past couple of years was the introduction of the managed product. So now, the way the firm used to be is we would help individuals build their own portfolios of stocks. We would discuss the companies. We would charge them a commission. Now, we're mainly managing money for our clients. So the clients will send us money, and they don't talk about the particular stocks with the broker. We just have asset managers that will build the portfolios, and we charge a fee. And for people who have less money and they can't qualify for the managed program, which the minimum is $250,000 for the managed program, I've created mutual funds. I now have 7 mutual funds that I run myself with a team of portfolio managers that basically copy all the things that we would do with the separately managed accounts. So now you can just buy my mutual funds instead of having to buy all the individual stocks, because the mutual funds own those stocks. And you can actually buy these funds through other firms. You don't even have to you can buy them at Europe Pacific Capital, but you can buy them at a lot of other firms too. We have our firms, my mutual funds are on platforms of other brokers.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, Peter. As far as strategies go, I have 2 things that I think are related. One is, I'm a real estate agent, and I'm curious as to where I think the market is going. I've been focused on short sales and working with investors who are interested in buying those short sales. Where do you see that going? Should I avoid that altogether or reinvest?
Well, it depends on the market.
Right.
You have to know each individual market. What are your rental opportunities that are there? And how short is the short sale? And of course, a short sale doesn't necessarily mean value. It just means that the property is being sold below the mortgage. Well, it could be worth a lot less than the mortgage. I mean,
Well,
just
New York has a 10-year shadow inventory they're estimating, so it's...
but what is that shadow industry if interest rates go up?
Right.
Right? And then, imagine this, interest rates go up, and now we're in a worse recession. So now you have higher rates and even more unemployment. The shadow industry, is not just a shadow, it's just a mountain.
Right.
And it's not it's right out there. So it all depends on the individual. And of course, a lot of it depends on how much money your investor is going to have to sink into the property. Because when you buy investment property, oftentimes the banks want a lot of down payment money. And the question is, where else might you invest that down payment money to get a much better return? Now, yes, you are getting some leverage, but what I find out is, if it's an investment property, maybe you can't get a 30-year fixed. Maybe you're going to get, more of an adjustable rate financing,
Right.
where you're leaving yourself exposed to a run-up in rates.
And then quickly, I have 2 daughters that are about to enter the job market. One just did, and one's going to be another 5 or 10 years down the road. As far as planning for this debacle that's going to happen, what type of career should I direct them into to possibly withstand this, or maybe even be able to come out?
Yeah,
take advantage of the
I
situation?
first of all, I'd say, definitely let them get as big of college loans as they can at this point. Because I think that, they're going to just forgive them. Either inflation is going to wipe them out, or politicians are going to trip over themselves over, who's willing to forgive the most amount of student debt.
Right.
Because you have this huge student population in debt, and the government wants their votes, and they want their votes by telling them they don't have to pay back the debt. So I think it's going to be a bailout for the students, loan forgiveness, so you're going to feel left out if you didn't have a student loan.
Right.
Because, you can, even if you don't use the money for college, you can buy all sorts of stuff with that money. And of course, the student loans, that's the reason that college is so expensive in the first place. But to the extent that you're going to blow any government money on an education, and you actually want to do something worthwhile, because the problem is right now with all the government programs, there's no incentive to actually get a degree that has any relevance or any value. You just go and get a degree because the government tells you need a degree to get a job. It doesn't really matter, what the degree is or what the job is. I read that something like 40% of the minimum wage jobs are held by people who went to college. Now, not all of them graduated, but at least they went. But what good is college if all you can get is a minimum wage job? I can get that job out of high school. Most kids can get a minimum wage job, as soon as they're old enough for a work permit. You know, you don't need to go to high school or college to serve French fries. But this is the problem. I mean, we tell everybody that they need to go to college. They don't. I mean, you don't need a college degree for everything. I mean, in fact, most jobs don't require a college degree. In fact, most jobs, whatever you need to learn, you learn on the job. You don't learn anything in college. But to the extent that they're going to be there, look, there are certain things that you learn in college that are worthwhile. They're going to study computers, engineering. I mean, there are hard sciences that you can learn in a classroom. And if you're going to do that, right, and you're going to study, geology or, there are things you can think of, languages. I think if you can learn Mandarin, things that you can learn, where you can go anywhere in the world and apply your skills, right? Mechanical engineering, architecture. So there are certain things that we need. But I would not encourage them just to go for a liberal arts program, just to go there and be another one in the crowd with a sociology degree or a political science degree, even economics. I don't think these degrees have any real value in the marketplace. Everybody's got them, and what do you really know? And you people study not only all kinds of philosophy of sports. And a lot of, I know, when we went to college, the idea was to find the courses, that would require the least amount of effort because we didn't want it to interfere with our partying. I mean, it was, especially, you're in a fraternity or, you're going to parties, you're drinking, the last thing you want is studying to get in your way. So you find the courses that require very little studying. You have them, physics without math, or, whatever they have. They had all kinds of Mickey Mouse courses, this is in Berkeley I had that you can take, that everybody knew, were an easy pass, or, you don't have to do anything. And of course, and when everybody's there spending taxpayer money, everybody, nobody cares what this stuff costs. I mean, if the students actually had to pay for college and there were no loans, and it was people wouldn't waste money. They would just go and they would study things because they really wanted to learn and increase their marketable skills, not because they were looking to take a vacation for 5 years or 6 years before they actually had to start working. But this is the society we take. So you want to encourage them to learn things that are actually going to be of value. And not just, go, people say, well, we need college because of the experience. It's, people grow as a person. Yeah, you don't have to borrow $150,000, $200,000 to grow as a person, right? You can do that without college. And in fact, whatever you learn in college, you can learn it. The internet is there, the books, it's so easy today for people to learn stuff. You don't need to sit in a classroom to learn things. In fact, some of the best lecturers are online. You can get all this stuff. People can have access. So people can educate themselves. They don't need a fancy university, where all the money goes into the gymnasiums and the off-student housing and all the fancy restaurants. I mean, that's all a waste of money. And that was built up on government credit. But as I said, at this point, I've told people that college is a waste of money, college is a bubble. But, at this point, as I said, I think they're going to forgive the debt anyway. Yeah.
Hi, Peter. When people talk about whether or not we should buy gold, if it's a good idea, they usually focus on the debate between deflation and inflation. Recently, I've heard some people say they look at it as protection against any circumstances where you stray from the normal. So whether or not it's deflation or inflation, it can still work out. Did you agree with that?
Well, I think the price of gold is going to go up in real terms relative to just about everything. Whether it happens in a deflationary collapse or an inflationary collapse doesn't really matter. See, let's say the price of gold goes from $1,600 an ounce to $800. That's a 50% drop. But everything else goes down 70%, the price of everything else. Whether it's food, energy, stocks, real estate, well, gold has still gone up. On the other hand, if the price of gold goes from $1,600 to $3,200, it doubles, but the price of everything else only goes up by 25%, well then, gold prices went up. They go up on both scenarios. Now, the people who think we're going to have a deflationary collapse, though, I think are wrong. I think they're basing it on historical comparisons to when we were on a gold standard. If we were still on a gold standard, there would be no question that we would have deflation. It wouldn't even be an argument. we'd have massive deflation, and that's what we need. We have an inflationary boom, it's followed by a deflationary bust. That's just the way it works. But we don't have, we're not on a gold standard. We don't have real money. We have fiat money, we have a printing press. And as the deflationary bust starts, the government can prevent it in nominal terms by printing money. This is what Ben Bernanke has told us. He said in his famous speech that resulted in the nickname Helicopter Ben, and I still think I coined that term. A lot of people use it. I think it originated with me. I just don't get any credit for it. But Helicopter Ben, he got that moniker because he said that we have an invention called the printing press. And unfortunately, I wish somebody had not told him about that investment, but he knows about it. And he said, we will print as much money as we have to, if we have to drop it from helicopters to prevent deflation. That's what he said. And he's right. If the government prints enough money, prices will not fall. Right? In nominal terms, they won't. But in real terms, they will collapse even faster. That's what's going to happen. See, it's not that the prices will come down, it's that the value of the money will come down even faster. So let's say stocks lose 90% of its value, but money loses 95% of its value. Well, then stocks are still going to go up in nominal terms, even though they've collapsed in real terms. So this is what's going to happen, because the Fed is not going to sit back. Like I said earlier, is the Federal Reserve going to sit back and let Bank of America fail? Is it going to sit back and let the depositors at Bank of America lose their money? Right? Is the government really going to let Americans go to the ATM machine and they put the card in and it says, sorry, your money's gone. We lost it. We bet it on real estate and it didn't work out so good. Right? Tough. Are they going to let that happen? Is the government going to tell people, look, we know we promised you Social Security benefits, but we spent the money on foreign wars, and so the money's gone and we just got nothing for you? Are they going to say that? Are they going to tell the pensioners that work at the post office and work for the government, so you know what, we ran out of money, sorry. No, I mean, the way out of it is to say, oh, Social Security, no problem. They print that up, here you go, here's Social Security money. Bank teller, hold on, how much do you need? Right? Nobody loses, right? If they create enough money, nobody has to lose anything. But the problem is, if they create enough money, everybody loses everything. That's the problem. That's the choice. Right? But if they choose, and you got guys like Rector or Harry Dent, they actually think that that's what's going to happen. They think the government is going to be honest. After all the years of lies, they're finally going to get religion and let it all happen. Right? Maybe. But you know what? Even if they do that, you're still better off with gold. Because what are you going to do? Under that scenario, if your money is in the bank, you lose it. If your money is in bonds, you lose it because they default. Under the Harry Dent scenario, or the Robert Prechter scenario, the only place your money is safe is under your mattress. You actually have to physically have the bills. Because if you have it in any other form, you're not going to get it back.
Peter, when you think about a crash, do you think of it as a sort of sudden, unexpected event, like Monday things are fine, Tuesday it's not, or do you think of it as a sort of a long sliding process? And if it is sudden, what would be the event that would be the catalyst to trigger some kind of a crash as you think about it?
Well, I think when it does happen, it's going to unravel very quickly. I don't think it's going to take place over decades. I think these crises tend to hit. If you think about how quickly the real estate bubble fell apart once it was in motion, or the NASDAQ bubble, think about how quickly the crises have escalated in Europe. These events, once they start, they really snowball. And, I think it's going to be very quick. That's one of the reasons that I tell people, you've got to be prepared in advance. You can't wait, and you can't worry that you're too early. You can't worry that I buy gold and the price goes down, or I buy foreign stocks and the dollar goes up, or whatever. You can't worry. Because if you're trying to get in at the perfect time, the one thing I know for sure is you're not going to succeed. And I'd rather be years early than a day late. If you're a day late, you're too late, right? So you got to do it early. And, the problem with, the markets can be irrational for a while, and people do very foolish things. And you just don't know how long that irrationality is going to last. It lasted, for a while in the stock market and then the real estate bubble, but eventually the fundamentals come out. And I think this is the major seminal event that we're waiting for, is going to be the unraveling of the U.S. I mean, think about the Soviet Union. Think about how quickly that disintegrated. If you remember back to that time period in the late 80s, I mean, this was quick. I mean, and they went like dominoes. I mean, the Soviet Union went from being this ominous superpower, I mean, it was nothing. It was gone. And so, people look at America in a certain way. They are not going to look at America that way when this crisis is over. And it is going to, unfold itself very rapidly. So the first thing that I said we got to do is protect ourselves so we don't personally go broke. And let's hope that the government doesn't steal our wealth if we avoid the crash, because believe me, there will be a lot of pressure to punish the so-called speculators who got rich off of other people's misery. Oh, let's tax the people that own gold or own oil or whatever it is. We all need to get wiped out of this thing, but we got to try to protect our wealth, but then we got to work, to try to influence the political debate so that we can get that country headed back in the right direction. Because when you have this type of social unrest that we might have as a result of, you can picture long gas lines again, we can have price controls on gas, we can have price controls on food. Can you imagine waiting on long lines just to get the bare necessities out of the supermarket? A lot of this stuff is going to happen, so we've got to be very, very careful. Yeah.
Hi, Peter. I just turned 25, I work in the medical field, and I'm one of the people that are looking to get out before the crash.
Get out of what?
To get out of the U.S. before the crash.
Oh, so you want to really get out?
Yeah, plant a flag somewhere else. Being that I work in the medical field, where do you see growth abroad in the medical field, or where would you go if you were me at 25?
I don't know. I mean, because a lot of it is personal, the languages you speak, I don't know what kind of women you like. I'm assuming you're still single. So, I don't know. But medicine, look, one thing is, if you have a medical degree, and we still have good universities here, and if you have a degree from an American university, you can pretty much work as a doctor anywhere you want. So you kind of want to, and there's always going to be people that are getting sick, so you're always going to be able to work as a doctor. Doctors are always in demand. And whether you're just a physician or if you're in the research end of it and developing, there are viable careers there. So you certainly have your pick. And if you're trying to apply for residence or work permits, hey, a doctor is very easy because everybody wants doctors coming in. No question, you got a medical degree from a major U.S. university, you're the kind of person that people want in their country, right? No one ever says, oh, we got too many doctors. So, it's a good career path. It's not for everybody because it's not, they don't just give out those diplomas, like cotton candy. But, I think wherever you want to work, you look around, look at the countries that we invest in, or, travel a little bit, and decide where you like it. Where you like the culture. And then look at the taxes. We've got people now that I've got some people that are working for me at Europac, my bank, Euro Pacific Bank, and there they have opportunities to live anywhere in the world and work, and we don't take taxes out. If they work where the bank is, it's tax free. But other countries they can work at, and they can pick where they want to live, and they can earn money tax free. And just look at the various tax rates in different countries and the freedoms that you have there. I don't know whether you're ultimately thinking about living there permanently or trying to get your citizenship. If you are thinking about renouncing U.S. citizenship, it's better to renounce it now before you have any real money and before they increase the price of that form again. Because as long as you're an American citizen, theoretically, no matter how much money you earn abroad, even if you're working in a tax haven, Uncle Sam still wants his cut. I've read stories about people who are dual citizens who have never come to this country, but who owe the IRS a fortune. I read an article, I think somebody from Canada ended up buying like a condo, and the IRS seized it. He'd never even been here. And they said, well, you're half American, and you haven't been paying taxes. He's never even had American, he's never traveled here. Then he came here and bought a place or something, and they seized it. So it's one of the most dangerous things to have is a U.S. citizenship.
This is more of a political question, but I know in your video blogs and interviews you talk about government as being a threat to liberty, but I wonder if you think it would be appropriate to sometimes discuss the nature of the monetary system being a debt-based money, that creates a whole set of special interests, both of the banks and the corporations that surround them. They have access to the credit creation and money creation mechanism, and I think that's a danger.
Well, the problem isn't
equally large
necessarily,
danger of human liberty.
the problem isn't necessary that it's debt-based. I mean, you're saying debt-based, meaning the way the money is coming into circulation is the Federal Reserve is buying the Treasury, and therefore there's debt that's behind the issuance of that paper money. The problem is that there's paper money. I mean, if we got rid of the Federal Reserve and we just let Congress print money to pay its bills, in which case it wouldn't have to issue bonds that the Fed would then buy, it would still be just as bad. I mean, what we need is real money, not fiat money. It needs to be based on something tangible, something with intrinsic value, something that is scarce, something that the government can't create out of thin air. That is the problem. We're trying to run a capitalist economy without money. You know, we need real money, not this money substitute that we've been operating under. And again, that is, you know, I said earlier in the show, in this presentation, that the problem is rates are too low. That's the fundamental problem in our economy. Well, why are rates too low? Because we're on a fiat system. If we were still on a gold standard, it would be impossible for rates to be manipulated low by the central bank. And of course, you have all the criticism that you get about the gold standard from the central bankers or from the economists is that it takes away the ability of the federal government to try to, you know, stimulate the economy. Exactly. That's why it's so good. Because the Fed, when they stimulate the economy, they blow up bubbles, like the housing bubble or the stock market. They create distortions. We don't want the government playing around with the economy for political reasons. And gold is the discipline. Gold prevents central bankers from trying to buy our votes with false prosperity.
Hi, Peter. Ben Bernanke says that he will keep the rate low, near zero till end of 2014. You think he's going to keep that promise?
Well, it depends. You know, because if the rates are still this low, believe me, if 2014 gets here, he's going to extend it to 2016, 2017. He can't let them go up. But, you know, can he really keep them there that long without it blowing up in his face? That is going to be the problem. As I said, the one thing that's keeping the Fed alive right now is the problems in Europe and maybe some problems in China. But to the extent that the world ever creates the perception that it's got its act together, if we ever get a greater sense of optimism, then it's impossible. You know, and there are people that think, well, you know, if the economy is growing, then we can have higher interest rates. No, we can't. The minute interest rates go up, any growth that we think we have in America will vanish. Because it's all a function. Look at the GDP numbers that we just had. It was all, we got them on Friday, it was all an increase in consumer spending. Why are American consumers spending? It's the last thing they should be doing. But they're spending. It's all this cheap borrowed money. Our trade deficit is going up again. It's almost, you know, it's the highest it's been since the financial crisis. We've got big trade deficits. Our savings rate is falling. We're doing all the things that produced the last crisis. And it's only that interest rates are still at rock bottom that we can afford to do it. So the minute that rates go up, it's over.
Do you have a ballpark timeline?
I said, no, I don't have a timeline. I don't have the, you know, the crystal ball. You know, I wish I had it. But I don't know exactly when it's going to start. I do know that it's going to happen. There's no way around it. I know that we can't live, this model is not viable. How much longer? It's like, you know, how many straws can you put on a camel's back? I don't know. I know that there's a limit. At some point, the weight is too heavy. But which one, how many, I don't know. I just think that the camel, to me, right now, looks like he's basically overcome the straws. I mean, it looks like his knees are shaking. You know, he can barely stand it. You know, can he take, how many more can you put on there? I don't know. But I know there's a limit. At some point, you reach the limit, and then one more straw, and then that's it.
Peter, my question is about silver. Gold has been mentioned a lot here. My question is, do you see silver being a better investment than gold, and in what form would you buy silver? For instance, would you consider silver coins, like silver dimes, if there was a reasonable markup of, let's say, no more than 5%?
Well, I mean, I like both gold and silver to own. I mean, I think ultimately silver might outperform gold if the prices go as high as I think they will. But, you know, I've generally told people to have more gold than silver, maybe 2 to 1 gold and silver. But you can play around with it. I mean, if you see the metals diverging, you know, if you want to add to your position, you could look at the relative prices and decide, should I buy gold, should I buy silver? I mean, the thing is you want to buy bullion, just bullion coins and bars. You don't want to get talked into buying some numismatic coin or rare coin by a salesman who's trying to make an extra commission. You just want to buy basic. For silver, too, you can buy junk silver, so you have quarters and dimes. If you think you might use them for barter, it's good to have some of your silver. But if you have more silver, you can have, you know, 5-ounce bars, 10-ounce bars, 100-ounce bars, depending on how much you're buying. We've got a little booth out front. Like, there's a couple of guys out there from my precious metals company, which is Euro Pacific Precious Metals. And we don't even sell numismatics, so you don't have to worry about my guys trying to, you know, push you into those products. And, you know, we have reasonably low markups, which is what you want. We also sell Perth Mint through the broker-dealer if you want to own gold and have it stored in Australia. So you have it out of the country, but if you want it physically delivered to you, where you can have it with you, we do that at Euro Pacific Capital. But as I said earlier, stay away from, you know, if you want to collect coins, I mean, you can collect coins just like people collect art, people collect stamps, they collect memorabilia. But, you know, a 200-year-old coin or that's never been circulated, you know, where there's only 10 in the world or something, you know, it's a rare item, but it's not a gold investment. Maybe the coin was made of gold, but you're not buying it for the gold any more than you're buying a baseball card for the cardboard, right? It doesn't matter what it's made of, right? You're not paying. But the problem is a lot of these coins that they say are numismatic have no numismatic value. They're not scarce at all, yet they jack up the markup because they convince you you're getting something rare when you're not. What you are getting is stuck with an overpriced coin. And then if you try to sell it, you know, you need the price of gold to pretty much double or silver just to get your money back. And, you know, eventually the prices will go up enough probably that you will be able to get your money back and then some, but why not just profit? You know, why give all your profits to the salesman? But anyway, talk to the Europac Metals reps, they're out front.
Hi Peter, before I ask my question, I just wanted to say, I saw you on TV back in 05, 06 maybe, when you were saying that there was going to be a crash and most people weren't believing you, and I picked up your strategies in your books. Right then, it's made a big, big difference over the last 5 years. So my question is, I manage money for clients who are looking to really cash in on the gold and silver rush and commodities in general. And I'd say from about 2009 till early 2011, we did really great in the mining stocks. So my question is, do you still see the mining stocks as, especially now that they've come down to historic valuations? I mean, I've increased exposure over the last week or two. Do you think that that's the best bet if you're trying not just to protect your wealth, but really,
Yeah, I mean, I have added personally to gold stocks in the last couple of weeks, the stocks I own for myself, and I think they are. You know, for people who believe in the gold story and who want to lever exposure, I think there's tremendous opportunities in those stocks. And I think just even short term, I mean, it's always hard to trade short term, but I think the US dollar is looking weak. We had an outside week 2 weeks ago where, the dollar index took out the previous week's high, closed below the previous week's low. This week we closed right on the low of the week. Despite all these negative headlines coming out of Europe this week, we had a Spanish downgrade, we had these French elections. I mean, people are really worried, yet the dollar is going down anyway. And even though gold stocks were weak, the price of gold has been rising steadily for the past week, even with gold prices. The gold stocks turned around the last couple of days of the week, but they had been falling even as the price of gold had been rising. And to me, it looks like gold has even broken out. And of course, you probably got my favorite indicator of all, the Dennis Garthman indicator. So he has pronounced the gold bull market dead yet again. And so, that's a pretty good sign that we're about to have a huge rally. Of course, when it rallies, he'll claim he was with us the whole time until the next drop when he claims, oh my God, it's all over. So yeah, I would be buying, I am buying, those stocks. And, so if you have accounts with us, if you're not talking to your brokers about, if you got to be speculative. These are mining stocks, so there are dividends there now. They're not the greatest dividends, but they're greater than the typical stock in the S&P 500. But we've got dividend strategies now where we're collecting 8-9% dividends on stocks, so we can't get that out of gold stocks, but you can get 2 or 3%, which is a lot better than you get on most stocks, and it's certainly a lot better than you get in cash or CD. And these are mining companies that actually have a lot of gold. Part of the problem with some of the mining companies, like Goldcorp last week, announced higher than expected production costs. And it's kind of ironic that people think there's no inflation, yet the gold mining companies are having problems because it's costing so much to mine the gold. Why are the costs of mining rising so fast? Inflation. The problem is so many people think there is no inflation. So when people wake up and appreciate how much inflation there is, I think that's very bullish for gold prices. And of course, to the extent that high production costs keep new mines from coming on the market, that only is more bullish for gold, because it means the supply is growing even more slowly despite the increased demand because of the escalated costs. Yeah.
Whether a person is in college or not, what is the best thing for a young person to do with their money that they're saving?
Well, send it to Euro Pacific. But depending on how much you have, if you don't have enough, the minimums on our mutual funds are $2,500, by the way. But if you don't even have enough for that, I've told people that it makes sense just to buy some of the things you think you're going to need in a year or two. If I expect consumer prices for the things we actually buy to go up at least 10, 20, or 30% a year. The things you really buy, razor blades, shaving cream, mouthwash, deodorant, whatever they are, certain food items, jar of peanut butter, or, things that will last. So you might want to go and figure out all the things that you would buy next year and just buy them now, because they're going to be a lot cheaper. And let's assume, you buy a box of cornflakes and you eat it, you open it up next year, and, when you bought it, it was $6, and next year it's $9. You've got a 50% gain, no taxes on that gain. Just eat the cornflakes. Compared to people who said, look, I'm going to put some money, and this is why I said earlier, why would you save? Why would I put $500 in a savings account to spend it next year when I'll only be able to buy $450 worth of stuff? Why not just buy the $500 worth of stuff right now? And as long as you have some storage room in your apartment, you can go buy it. There's some of these products, I buy them. I bought them I get my hair cut, and every once in a while I run out of the product that I usually buy one of these products. And every time I have to buy one, I'll notice, because I'll have the product at home. I haven't used it all up, and I'll buy another one. And every time I buy one, the price is much higher than the last time I bought it. And they might last 6 months. But, if I would just buy, 10 bottles and hold them, because I can see the prices going up. And in fact, in my radio show, businessmen call me all the time, just telling me how much their prices are going up all the time. No one tells me that prices are going down. Oh, is it? All right, one more question. Give me
One more question before. If you want to hang out, we'll be here for a little while over by that area with the drinks. If you want to book sign, things like that. We still have more beverages. So after this last question, everyone files out. If you want to meet us over by the little area over there.
Yeah, I will be signing those books, and if we have any extra copies, you're more than welcome to buy them. We probably have more books than we had tickets, so there probably are some extras.
I always hear Ron Paul saying, if we don't end the Fed, it'll self-destruct. Now, if Ron Paul's not elected, will that happen? And afterwards, what's it going to take to go back to a gold standard?
Well, I think going back to a gold standard is going to be, easier than leaving it. You'd think. How was Nixon able to convince us to go off it in the first place? Of course, he said it was temporary. He's right, it is temporary. It's just taking a long time. But we went from $1 backed by something to $1 backed by nothing. So we have to go from $1 backed by nothing to $1 backed by something. So it is not hard to go back on a gold standard. Technically, it's not that hard to do. It just takes the political will to do it. And I think it's a much better thing for the economy to do that. So, the aftermath will be very positive. The question is, when is it going to happen? I don't think even Ron Paul, and in fact I know that Ron Paul is not advocating for the elimination of the Fed. He would like to see it eliminated eventually, but that's not his immediate plan, because I think Ron Paul has the same concerns that I do. If we abolish the Fed, that Congress will just take over its functions, and that's even worse. So rather than abolishing the Fed and creating a vacuum, let's just reform the Fed so that it reflects more of what it used to be than what it is. So it's no longer an engine of inflation and of accommodation, but a truly independent body where interest rates are not set by the Fed, but they're determined by the market. And what the Fed does is maintain the integrity of the dollar, and we can put the Fed back on the gold standard, because when the Federal Reserve was first created, we had a gold standard. We had a Fed and a gold standard simultaneously. And initially, Federal Reserve notes had to be backed 40% by gold. And of course, they were redeemable 100% in gold by the Treasury, if it was, or by the Fed, they were redeemable. They were redeemable in gold, but they were backed. And the Federal Reserve was not allowed to hold any U.S. Treasuries. They weren't even allowed to own them. So let's go back to that. Let's take power away from the Fed, but not give that power to the government, to Congress. Now, if we can shrink the Fed and take away its powers gradually over time, maybe we can eliminate it completely without fearing, what the government might do. But right now, just getting rid of the Fed is probably too dangerous, because as bad as they are, there's an old saying, the devil you know. Well, the thing is, I know the other devil, right? Congress. I mean, imagine if Congress or the president could just print money without even having to worry about the Fed. As reckless as they are now, they'd be even more reckless. Anyway, thanks for coming.
One more question. A quick question.
Well, all right. This is really the last question.
One more thing. This is being videotaped. If you guys want to see this in the future, if once was not enough, I'd imagine this guy's filming it in a week or two. It'll be up on YouTube, and I'll send an email out to everyone who came to remind me of that.
Right, but there are plenty of other. I've said the same stuff in other seminars, so you can go ahead.
Your mutual funds, as well as individuals investing in companies overseas, what currency are you using to do that investing?
Well, we invest dollars here, but when we own mutual funds, in the stocks that we invest for clients, we're investing all around the world. So we're acquiring other currencies, but most of our clients, certainly American clients, are depositing U.S. dollars. So we're using the dollars to buy the other currencies that we need to buy the stocks on foreign exchanges.
If the dollar falls apart, how do you protect it?
Well, by definition, if the dollar falls apart and we own all these foreign securities or foreign bonds, assuming that the other currencies don't also fall apart, then your purchasing power is preserved. So all else being equal, let's say you took $100,000 and you bought 100,000 Canadian dollars. I mean, the exchange rate is pretty much 1-to-1. I think actually the Canadian dollar, you need $1 to buy 1 Canadian dollar. So the Canadian dollar right now is a little bit more valuable. But let's say the dollar were to lose 90% of its value against the Canadian dollar, and you had 100,000 Canadian dollars. Well, all else being equal, those 100,000 Canadian dollars would be worth $1 million US dollars. So, but you wouldn't have any more purchasing power, because everything you wanted to buy would be 10 times as expensive. But at least you wouldn't have lost your purchasing power. The person who had his $100,000 in dollars, he feels like he only has $10,000, because he can only buy what $10,000 used to buy. But by staying in the Canadian dollar and avoiding the US dollar, all else being equal, right? If the Canadian dollar maintains its purchasing power and the dollar collapses by 90%, and now you're equal.